Certainly when you look at the other side of the equation, when you look at soybean crush, domestic soybean crush, where we are in there, soybean oil demand, most of that soybean demand, oil demand is consumed here in the United States. Only about 10% is exported. So unlike whole soybeans, where 40 to 50% of our soybeans that we produce in a year are exported, once we crush those soybeans here domestically, that soybean oil is primarily going to stay here in the country and be used here in the country. Very little exports in terms relative to some of the other commodities for soybean oil. Soybean meal demand a little bit larger. When you look at export demand there, about 23% of the soybean meal that we produce in the United States on a given year is exported. The remaining 77% is used domestically here, primarily in our livestock sector as a feed product. So when you look at soybeans, about half and half in terms of domestic use and export demand. But when you look at the products that we produce from soybeans, soybean oil, soybean meal, much more of those commodities are staying domestically. And so the domestic market and the economy in the United States has a much bigger impact on those two products, soybean meal, soybean oil, than they certainly would for whole soybeans, as the whole soybeans relies a lot more on export demand than the products do. Speaking of soybean meal and soybean oil, typically what do we get out of a bushel of soybeans? Soybean meal, out of a bushel of soybeans, which weighs 60 pounds, a bushel of soybeans is 60 pounds, 44 pounds, or about 44 pounds of that is soybean meal. You get about 11 pounds out of a bushel of soybeans in soybean oil, and then the remainder, about 3 to 4 pounds, is in soybean hull. So as you can see from this factor, when you look at soybean crush is the process of taking that whole soybean, crushing it, generating soybean meal, generating soybean oil, generating soybean hulls, and then selling those products. So we're transforming the whole soybean into these products. What makes soybean crush profitable more than any other is the price and demand for soybean meal, simply because we produce so much more soybean meal than we produce of the other two products, soybean hulls and soybean oil. So soybean crush and the profitability in soybean crush, and therefore the demand for whole soybeans to go into soybean crush, is driven in large part by the price situation, the market situation for soybean meal. This gives you kind of a snapshot of some of the areas that we move soybean meal, or that are demand areas for soybean meal. And as you can see here, the vast majority of that soybean meal is used in the poultry industry. Really, when you look at the whole pie of this chart, all of it, for the most part, is going into our livestock sector. Of that livestock sector, the poultry is our largest user of soybean meal, followed by the pork industry. So when we look at the prospects for soybean meal markets and soybean meal prices, a lot of that's going to be influenced by what's happening in the poultry and the swine industry. If we're seeing an expansion in poultry, an expansion in swine production, chances are we're going to see a pretty big increase in the demand for soybean meal. That's going to make soybean crush very profitable, and that's going to drive the demand for soybeans from our producers. That's going to drive that demand and hopefully create and support prices that are very favorable for our soybean producers. Similarly to soybean meal, this is a graph of soybean oil consumption. Again, most of that soybean oil consumption is used in food and food products. The green portion there, 46% of the total soybean oil consumption is in salad or cooking oil. So the vast majority of what we sell excuse me, in soybean oil production is to that market. The other major factor there is in biodiesel production, and certainly we've seen that expansion in biodiesel production increased since the mid-2000s, and with government policy and the renewable fuels mandate that we continue to have as part of our government policy, we would expect at a minimum that biodiesel demand for soybean oil to maintain and potentially increase as we move out into the future. Again, so when we look at what's happening from a soybean oil situation, market situation, when we look at things that affect food demand, when we look at macroeconomic situations, the economy and employment, growth of our economy, all those things can impact our demand for food and for fuels in the case of biodiesel, which then can have an impact on what we see happening for prices for soybean oil. The prices for soybean oil can have an impact on domestic crush again, and then ultimately that's going to potentially have an impact on where we see the prices that our producers receive for those whole soybeans. As I mentioned earlier, the soybean market, like many of our other markets, have become more global in nature. So when we look at the factors that impact the markets for our soybeans, here we have to look at much more than just a domestic market, just what's happening here in the United States. We've got to look at what's happening around the world. And this has become increasingly important over the last 5 to 10 years in the soybean market, because we've seen a pretty substantial increase in production and competition in South America. When you look at, and again, as you look at the USDA monthly supply and demand report, as I showed you earlier, they also have a table for world soybean supply and demand, which will give us some insight in terms of what's happening from a production and a use standpoint not only across the U.S. but across the world. When you look at this next graph, this kind of shows a picture of where we're at in terms of the U.S., Brazil, and Argentina, our two major competitors in the world soybean market. The blue bar is the United States, and you can see over the last 5 to 6 years that we've been relatively flat in terms of soybean production. But when you look at Brazil and Argentina, and particularly Brazil, we see, which is the red bar, we see a pretty substantial trend developing there, increases. 2011-12, we did see a little bit of a drop in soybean production in Brazil. That was primarily a function of drought conditions in that country. But overall, when you look at the trend, you see an increasing production in Brazil in particular, and also in Argentina, but just at a much lower level. But when you look at these three countries combined, they represent over 80% of the total soybeans produced in the world. 15 years ago, the U.S. was a primary supplier of soybeans in the world. That is no longer the case. When you look at Brazil and Argentina, and for the first time in 2013-14, Brazil is actually expected to outproduce the United States in terms of total soybean production. That would be the first time that it's happened. Brazil would replace the U.S. as the world's top soybean producer if those yields come to fruition. So 10 to 15 years ago, we could look at what's happening in the domestic U.S. market, and that would be enough to determine where prices may go in the future. Certainly when we look now, when we look at the increased production in South America, those countries are also exporting a lot of that soybean that they're producing. They're competing. We are competing with them for those customers that we mentioned a little bit earlier. So now we have to look at not only what's happening in the U.S., but on a much more global standpoint than we have at any point in time.